Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. You know I love digging through these old documents, and you guys sent over a fascinating one.
Yeah, this one's a real doozy.
The 1954 U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service Annual Report. I mean, the title alone.
It sounds dry, but trust me, this thing's a gold mine.
We're talking about a pivotal moment in U.S. history, mid-20th century.
Post-war anxieties, the Cold War was heating up, you had all these shifting populations.
And of course, a huge wave of Mexican laborers coming into the country.
It really captures the anxieties and the hopes of a nation grappling with these big questions about who gets to be an American.
Exactly. And how do we manage this flow of people across our borders?
And it's not just some abstract policy debate. We're talking about real people's lives.
Their dreams, their struggles, their families.
It's all right there in this report.
So let's jump right in. What's the first thing that jumps out at you when you flip through this thing?
The sheer scope of it, honestly.
Yeah, there are all these different sections, right?
People coming in, people going out, border control, deportations, the whole 9 yards.
It really shows you what the agency was dealing with back then.
And one thing that just pops out right away is the sheer number of detentions.
Detentions?
Yeah, in 1954 is a record year, over 508,000.
Wow, over 500,000 people detained.
And 9/10 of those detentions happened right there at the U.S.-Mexico border.
So right off the bat, we're seeing this is going to be a big part of the story.
Absolutely. This tension at the border, it's a recurring theme throughout the report.
And speaking of the border, there's this thing called Operation Wetback. I mean, the name alone is kind of jarring, right?
It definitely grabs your attention, and it reflects the language of the time.
So tell us, what was Operation Wetback?
It was a massive campaign launched in June of '54 to try and stop illegal entries from Mexico.
Okay, so kind of a crackdown.
Exactly. Instead of having Border Patrol spread thin across the whole border.
They decided to focus their efforts.
Right. They created these concentrated task forces starting in Southern California.
And they went after areas where undocumented immigrants were concentrated. So less about holding the line everywhere, more about targeted enforcement.
Exactly. They really wanted to make a show of force.
And they expelled over 23,000 people through Nogales, Arizona in just a few weeks.
Can you imagine that 23,000 people in just a matter of weeks?
They even had a daily bus service to transport people back across the border.
And to really ramp things up, they requested a $3 million budget for a permanent mobile force.
Wow, a permanent mobile force that shows you how serious they were about this.
Absolutely. They wanted to be able to tackle this issue nationwide, not just at the border.
So it wasn't just about enforcement, it was about sending a message.
You have to remember the context, right? Post-war America, there was this growing dependence on Mexican labor.
For agriculture, for other industries.
But at the same time, there's this rising fear of illegal immigration.
It seems kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
It's this real push and pull, right?
We need these workers, but we're also afraid of them.
And that tension, that duality, it's really at the heart of this whole story.
It's a story that continues to unfold even today.
Absolutely. The debates we're having now about immigration, they have roots that go way back.
Okay, so we've talked about the crackdown, but what about people who were trying to come to the U.S. legally?
Well, the report actually breaks down all the different pathways people were using.
Let's talk about that, because even just skimming through the report, it sounds complicated.
It was a complex system, for sure. They had what we called quota immigrants and non-quota immigrants.
Okay, hold on. Quota immigrants, what's that all about?
So basically, quotas were limits on how many people could come from certain countries each year.
So like a cap.
Exactly. And some countries had bigger quotas than others.
So it wasn't just about how many people in total, but also where they were coming from.
Exactly. And that really created a hierarchy of who was seen as more desirable.
And then non-quota immigrants would be those exempt from those limits.
You got it. So, for example, if you were married to a U.S. citizen.
You didn't have to worry about those quotas.
Right. There are also categories for people admitted under treaties, things like that.
So all sorts of different ways to come here legally.
But even then, it wasn't easy, even if you were applying legally.
There were still hurdles.
Tons of them. Paperwork, quotas, waiting periods. It was far from a guaranteed smooth journey.
So even with the right paperwork, it wasn't a cakewalk.
Yep. Not at all.
It's really eye-opening to see how much effort people had to go through just to get here.
Absolutely. And it makes you appreciate the determination and resilience of those who made the journey.
Now, one thing that really stuck out to me in the report was how much they talked about naturalization, becoming a citizen.
Yeah, they devoted a whole section to it.
Why do you think they focused so much on that?
Well, back then, becoming a U.S. citizen was seen as the ultimate step in becoming American.
It wasn't just about being here. It was about belonging.
Exactly. And it wasn't automatic. You had to apply. They ran background checks.
And you even had to pass literacy tests.
They really wanted to make sure people were committed to becoming American.
So just being in the U.S. wasn't enough. You had to prove yourself.
Right. And it's interesting because they point out some trends in the report.
Like what?
Well, naturalizations had actually gone down after World War II.
Really? Why do you think that was?
Well, during the war, there was this big push for folks to naturalize, especially those serving in the military.
But after the war, that need seemed less urgent.
Right. Plus, before 1952, many groups like Japanese people couldn't even become citizens because of their race.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
So when those restrictions were lifted, more people from those groups started applying for citizenship.
That makes sense.
And here's another fascinating detail. The report talks about how they wanted to make naturalization ceremonies more dramatic.
Make them more dramatic? What does that even mean?
They wanted to make these ceremonies into big public spectacles, almost like theatrical productions.
Interesting.
They wanted to instill this sense of pride and patriotism in the new citizens and also in the people watching.
They were really trying to shape the narrative around what it meant to become American.
Absolutely. And it makes you think, why was this such a big deal for them?
What were they trying to project about being American at the time?
It's a great question, and one that we could spend a lot of time unpacking.
This report is like a window into a whole different era, isn't it?
It really is so much to think about.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, there's this whole other section of the report about the legal challenges the Immigration Service was up against.
Lawsuits, court battles, the whole shebang.
That sounds juicy. Tell me more.
Is a whole legal minefield,
Hmm?
and one of the biggest battlegrounds was over how much power the courts had to overturn decisions made by the Immigration Service, like deportation orders.
Ah, so it was a power struggle. Who gets the final say?
Exactly. The courts were trying to figure out what their role was in this whole process.
Checks and balances in action, I guess, makes sense. What else were they fighting about?
Well, there was this thing called the saving clause in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Sounds kind of boring.
Saving clause.
Yeah, but it caused a ton of confusion because it wasn't clear if the old or new laws applied to certain cases.
Okay, you've lost me a bit, saving clause. Can you break that down for me?
Imagine someone came to the U.S. legally under the old rules, but then the law changed and made things stricter.
Yeah.
The saving clause was supposed to protect those people.
Those who are already here legally.
Exactly. But figuring out who it applied to wasn't always easy, led to all sorts of legal disputes.
So some people got caught in this gray area, not quite sure where they stood legally.
Exactly. And these weren't just abstract legal arguments either. These were real people's lives.
Right, their whole future was on the line.
And the report actually highlights a few specific cases which really bring this to life.
Okay, spill the tea. What kind of cases are we talking about?
Well, one case, Galvin v. Press, dealt with the government trying to deport someone who used to be a member of the Communist Party.
Oh, wow. This was during the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can imagine how sensitive that was. Anything that even hinted at communism was a huge red flag.
So what happened?
The Supreme Court ultimately sided with the government, which shows you just how strong those Cold War anxieties were.
Yeah, they were really cracking down on anything that seemed remotely subversive.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder how things would be different today.
For sure. I mean, the political climate is so different now. What other cases stuck out?
There was this other fascinating case, Barbara V. Gonzalez. It involved a Filipino man who came to the U.S. when the Philippines were still a U.S. territory.
So not really coming from a foreign country at the time.
Right, exactly. And later on, he got in some trouble with the law, and the question was whether his original arrival could even be considered entry under the new immigration law.
Which would make him deportable, right?
Exactly. It was this really tricky legal question.
So was he kicked out?
Nope. The Supreme Court actually sided with him, said he couldn't be deported.
Wow, that's a big win for him. It really highlights how complicated immigration law can be.
Especially when you're dealing with these unique historical circumstances, it wasn't always black and white.
So it sounds like the courts weren't just applying the law, but also interpreting it, figuring out how to make sense of it in a world that was rapidly changing.
You hit the nail on the head. And these weren't just legal cases. They were about people's lives, their families, their hopes and dreams.
It's easy to get lost in the legal details, but we have to remember the human cost of these decisions.
Absolutely. Every case represents a person, a story.
It's a good reminder that behind all the statistics and legal arguments, there are real people navigating this incredibly complex system.
And it's a system that was still evolving. Back then, they just passed this huge overhaul of immigration law in 1952.
The Immigration and Nationality Act.
Right, and everyone was still trying to figure out how to make it work in practice.
It's like when you get a new computer operating system, there are always bugs to work out.
Exactly, and you can see these court cases as attempts to iron out those wrinkles.
To try and find that balance between enforcing the law, being fair to immigrants, and dealing with the ever-changing reality of immigration itself.
It's exactly. It was a work in progress, and in many ways it still is today.
Makes you wonder if we're still grappling with some of those same bugs today. Are there any echoes of these legal battles in our current immigration debates?
Oh, absolutely. So many. The balance of power between the government and the courts, the different ways people try to come here legally, the criteria for deportation.
These issues are just as relevant today as they were back then.
It's like these questions are woven into the fabric of America itself.
And understanding how they played out in the past can give us some insights into how we might approach them today.
Exactly. History can be a powerful guide if we're willing to learn from it.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about, for sure. This whole deep dive has been fascinating.
It's been a journey, hasn't it?
We've covered so much ground, from the broad overview of what the Immigration Service was up to the nitty-gritty of legal battles, to the human stories behind the numbers.
And we haven't even touched on the data yet. The report is packed with it.
Oh, data. I love a good spreadsheet. What kind of stories do the numbers tell us?
Well, these numbers, they're more than just statistics. They help us paint a picture of who was coming to America in 1954, where they were coming from, what kind of work they did, even their age and gender.
So we can get a real sense of who these immigrants were, not just as numbers, but as people.
Exactly. And that helps us understand the social and economic impact they had on America. At the time, it adds another layer to the story of how the American identity was evolving.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, and each number is another clue.
And the more clues we find, the clearer the picture becomes.
So what's the first piece of this puzzle? Where were most of these immigrants coming from in 1954?
The top 5 sending countries were Mexico, Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Italy.
A real mix of North America and Europe. Makes sense, given what was going on in the world back then.
Right. The early 1900s saw this big shift in immigration patterns. Used to be mainly folks from Northern and Western Europe coming to America, but then more and more people started arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that trend continued right through the mid-century.
And, of course, Mexico had become a major source of immigration, especially with the Bracero program still going strong.
Exactly. The Bracero program was a guest worker program that allowed Mexican laborers to come to the U.S. for a limited time to work in agriculture and other industries.
Right. It started during World War II to help with labor shortages, but it kept going for decades after the war ended.
It really did so. By 1954, it was a well-established pipeline for Mexican workers coming to the U.S.
Which explains why Mexican immigration was so high that year. They needed those workers.
Absolutely. But the report goes deeper than just where people were coming from. It breaks down the age of these immigrants, too.
Okay, so were there a lot of young folks, older folks? What's the story there?
Well, if you compare the ages of immigrants to the general U.S. population back then, you see a much higher percentage of immigrants in their prime working years.
So younger folks looking for work.
It suggests that a lot of them were coming to America seeking economic opportunities.
That classic American dream, right? Coming to build a better life. Did they track what kind of jobs these immigrants were doing?
They did, and it's really fascinating. A huge chunk of them lifted their occupation as laborers, particularly farm laborers.
Working the land. It all ties back to the Bracero program and that demand for agricultural workers.
Right. The report even mentions that over 200,000 Mexican laborers were brought in through a collaboration between the Immigration Service and the Department of Labor.
Wow, that's a significant number. You can really see the impact of that program. So mostly farm workers, but what about other jobs? Anything else stand out?
While laborer was by far the most common, there were plenty of skilled tradespeople too. Mechanics, tailors, that sort of thing. And even professionals like teachers and nurses.
So it wasn't just people coming to pick crops. They were bringing all sorts of skills and knowledge, contributing to the economy in different ways.
Exactly. It paints this much richer picture of immigration than just that stereotype of low-skilled workers.
It's amazing how just looking at these numbers can really challenge some of those assumptions we might have about the past.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into the real lives of these people, not just some abstract idea of immigrants.
Right, and it makes you wonder about the individual stories behind those numbers. What were their hopes and dreams? What challenges did they face? What did they contribute to American society?
And it reminds us that the immigration story is never just about numbers, it's about people.
Well, this whole deep dive into the 1954 Immigration and Naturalization Service annual report has been truly eye-opening. We went from understanding the agency's overall activities to untangling complex legal battles to uncovering those human stories hidden within the data.
We've explored how political fears and economic needs shaped immigration policy, how the legal system tried to adapt to a changing world, and how data can give us this unique window into the lives of everyday people navigating those systems.
It's been fascinating to trace those threads back to a pivotal moment in U.S. immigration history and see how those echoes still resonate in the challenges we face today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you continue to explore the world of immigration, past and present, remember this. Every statistic, every legal battle, every policy decision, it all boils down to human stories. Never lose sight of that human element because that's where the true complexity and richness of this topic lies.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring those archives and keep asking those tough questions. And